The last thing we discussed was a somewhat of a technical point. We'll review it and move on. And that is the issue of two mitzvahs that could be counted as one, or they could be counted as two separate mitzvahs. In the case of Beis Din HaGadol, Beis Din HaGadol is required to oversee the Hebrew calendar, the Jewish calendar, in two different ways and in two different commands in the Torah. One is called HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim, and that means that Beis Din HaGadol is in charge of establishing the Chodesh. Then the Torah commands them, the same Beis Din, in Shmar Es Chodesh HaAviv. And the Torah goes ahead and says, Ushmarta es hachuka zos lemoado miyomim yomima. And this is at the end of Parshas Bo. And there the Torah is obligating Beis Din HaGadol to make sure that the calendar, the lunar calendar, is not off. There shouldn't be too much of a discrepancy between the lunar calendar and the solar calendar in terms of the equinox, in terms of the tkufos, in terms of summer, winter, etc. And the Torah wants the spring to be in the spring, and that's when Nisan is the month of Pesach. So that's called Ibur Hashanah. Ibur Hashanah means that we add an extra month every couple of years, an Adar Sheni, in order to equalize the two calendars, the lunar and the solar calendar, and guarantee that Chag Pesach will be in the Aviv, in the spring. Are these counted as two separate mitzvahs or one separate mitzvah? So before we get into the analysis of this way or that way, just want to read to you what the Ramban says in support of the Bahag. The Baal Halachas Gedolos, who predates the Rambam, says that we have two separate mitzvahs here. One mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh, to establish the new month, the new moon, and another mitzvah of Ibur Shana, where every once in a while they have to add a month to the Hebrew calendar year. And the Bahag counts this as two separate mitzvahs. And the Ramban has a proof to support the Bahag. So let's just read this inside. Again, there's a lot of technical stuff that we perhaps will skip, but we're on page Mem Ches, and we're 4 lines down from the top.
So from the way you just described it, it sounds like two. Could you just say quickly?
Give me, Bruce, just 1 minute. I just want to go through the technical part, and then we'll discuss whether it sounds like two. So you'll be first on my list. I just want to get by the technical reading here. He says, "Matzasi lo raya midivrayim zal amru b'sifri hazinu." So he quotes a sifri in Parshas Hazinu on the pasuk Hazinu Hashamayim v'Aretz, and based on this sifri, the Ramban is going to support the position of the Bahag that there are two separate mitzvahs. What does it say in the Sifri? The Sifri writes, Shalo asu mitzvos shenitnu lehem min hashamayim. The Torah is castigating or rebuking the people of Israel if they don't fulfill those mitzvahs that are given min hashamayim. And we'll soon see that there is another group of mitzvahs also mentioned by the Sifri, shenitnu lehem min haaretz. So what are these two categories of mitzvahs? Those mitzvahs that come from Azinu Hashamayim, and then we have mitzvahs that come v'haaretz, from the Aretz. So the Sifri explains, Elu hein mitzvot shenitnu lehem min hashamayim. What are the mitzvahs that have to do with the system, the celestial spheres? That's called min hashamayim, which has to do with the moon and the sun. And in that category, the Sifri lists two mitzvahs that are min hashamayim. Number one, Ibur Shanim, right, to add an extra month. well, what's the fancy word in English? I forget. Anyway.
Intercalate.
Intercalate. And then it says Kviyas HaChadoshim to determine the months. Shenemar, and the Sifri quotes the pasuk, V'hayu li osos u'lemoadim u'liyomim u'l'shanim. So that's called Hazinu Shamayim. Listen to the mitzvos that apply Min HaShamayim for the celestial spheres. And we list two different mitzvahs. We've got the mitzvah of Ibur Shanim, otherwise known as Chishuv HaTkufos, and we have the mitzvah of Kviyas Chadosh to determine the new month. Then the Sifri goes on to say, Ve'ha'aretz, Hazinu HaShamayim va'aretz, what are the mitzvahs that are on the ground? And we were chas v'shalom guilty of non-fulfillment. Shelo asu mitzvot shenitnu lahem min haaretz v'eluhen. And now I'm going to give you says the Sifri of the list of the mitzvos that are given lahem ba'aretz. Number one, leket, shichacha, upeya, truma, maser, shmita, v'yovel. Otherwise known as mitzvos hatluyos ba'aretz. So it means if I have a field in Ohio or in Iowa, I don't have to leave behind for the poor people leket, shikha, upeya, nor do I have to give truma to the Kohen or masa to the Levi from the produce of my land in Iowa, or for that matter, anywhere in the world outside of the land of Israel. So the word aretz in the pasuk of Hazinu Hashamayim ve'ha'aretz is referring specifically to the land of Israel, and more specifically to a list of 7 mitzvos that apply to the produce of the land of Israel. And the word Shamayim is a reference to 2 mitzvahs that are given to the Beis Din HaGadol, the highest court in Israel, to determine the new month and whether or not to add a month. Bruce, the floor is yours. Should we count them as 2 mitzvahs or 1?
It sounds like it's 2 separate acts, but despite that, the authority is given in the court, so you have to ask, what is the higher umbrella?
This is the #1 high school punter in the nation, and he's guaranteed to go to the NFL one day, but he might just...
Others move.
All right, we get a little insight into the National Football League. Okay, thank you for that. No, yeah, you're right. They're 2 different maisim. So if they're 2 different maisim, and they're 2 different zmanim, right? The Kiddush HaChodesh of HaChodesh Hazeh is every single month. The mitzvah of Shomer HaChodesh Hazeh, so Aviv, that only applies every couple of years. So they're 2 different maisim and 2 different zmanim. So that would lead me to the conclusion that the Bahag is right, and we should count them as 2 mitzvahs. What would be the counter argument, that of the Rambam? Because the Rambam insists on counting it as 1 mitzvah.
Perhaps it's based on the authority of the Beit Din to
Excellent.
do whatever they do.
Correct.
That's
These are the responsibilities that reflect the authority of Beis Din. Basically, you could combine these 2 mitzvahs, integrate them into 1 mitzvah, namely, who's in charge of the calendar, and that might break down into specifics. You have the calendar as far as the months are concerned. You have the calendar as far as the years are concerned, and so forth and so on. But both of these mitzvos are really one and the same mitzvah. So you see here a pattern that's going to become very relevant as we go along in the methodological difference between the Bahag in counting mitzvahs and the Rambam. The Rambam is interested in conceptualizing and in connecting and integrating mitzvahs into a greater whole. So, for example, in the case of tzitzis, you can already anticipate that even though I have to put tzitzis on each one of 4 knafos, how many mitzvahs is the Rambam going to count? Only 1, because all 4 knafos integrate into 1 whole, and the asu al kanfei bigdeim. Or, for example, you might talk about tefillin. you have Tefillin Shel Yad and Tefillin Shel Rosh. The Rambam would probably be more inclined, we'll see that the Rambam makes this as an exception to the rule, but as a rule, the Rambam would integrate these two into one whole. A person should be wearing tefillin. Now break that down into its parts. You've got Tefillin Shel Yad and Tefillin Shel Rosh, but it's basically one mitzvah. You could talk about the Bahag Shita in a totally different light. The Bahag Shita is going to emphasize the Maisa mitzvah. He's going to emphasize this Manema mitzvah. If you are commanded in two different actions and in two different times, then the Bahag is going to be more inclined to diversify and multiply the number of mitzvahs to count in Taryag. And this is going to be a methodological controversy that's going to repeat itself over and over, time and time again. So, for example, the Bahag, as we saw, counts even mitzvos d'Rabbanan in the Taryag. Once again, proliferating more and more mitzvahs because he's got new mitzvahs like Chanukah at the time of Chanukah, Purim at the time of Purim, reading the Megillah. He's got other mitzvahs d'Rabbanan like reciting Hallel, and he's going to count that in Taryag, and there are specific time periods, and it's a different Maisa mitzvah. So he's going to multiply the amount of mitzvahs. We're going to have to find, obviously, another methodological point or principle in the Bahag that allows him to combine mitzvahs together. Because if we don't find that, you're going to end up with a multiplicity of mitzvahs that goes way beyond Taryag. So, for example, if you're going to count tzitzis as 4 mitzvahs or tefillin as 2 mitzvahs, you go on and on and on. But there is one point that both the Bahag and the Rambam agree to, and we could call it unanimous. We do not combine all the mitzvahs of Aretz, even though the Rambam Shita is that we will combine the mitzvahs of Shamayim, as the Sifri interprets it, referring to Tkufos and Ibra Shana, and at the same time Kiddush HaChodesh. Those two can be collapsed because there's one conceptual rubric. But in the case of Aretz, and we have Leket and Shikha and Peah, and we have Trumos, and we have Maisros, and we have Yovelos and Shmitos, there the Rambam is going to count them all separately and multiply the numbers, even though there's a conceptual linkage that groups together these mitzvahs with a single common denominator, which is what? Kiddushas Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel sanctified. But the land of Israel being sanctified does not combine all these mitzvahs together. It's only the backdrop of the mitzvah. It only sets up a framework within which we'll find many, many different mitzvahs. So, for example, you can say that all 3 regalim fit into one framework, one backdrop, and that's Kedushas Hazman, the sanctity of time. But the Rambam will agree that each one of the 3 regalim will be counted separately in Taryag, because the Zman is not the goal of the mitzvah, it's only the backdrop of the mitzvah. In the case of the calendar, we have one goal, and that is to supervise the calendar. The Bahag might say that this is not one goal. What do you mean supervise the calendar? You have to supervise the calendar to be Makadosh the Chodesh. You have to supervise the calendar in order to guarantee that Nisan will fall out in Chodesh Aviv. Those are two different implementations of supervising the calendar. So there are different dimensions to the Hebrew calendar. One dimension is that every month is sanctified. And the other dimension is that when needed, we will add another month in order, as we said before, to reconcile the discrepancy between the lunar and solar calendars. Those are two.
Who's allowed to be on this type of a Bezdin?
Excellent. Who will serve on the Bezdin, Arthur asks. A wonderful, wonderful question. I was hoping somebody would ask that question. So I owe you one. In the case of Ibur Chodesh, we invite experts in the field to be part of the Ibur Hashana. Obviously, It's the Dayanim.
Non-Rebbeim?
Yeah, well, I don't know about non-Rebbeim. You have to know exactly what their status is, but it doesn't seem like they have to be members of the Sanhedrin Agdola. But for Kiddush HaChodesh, you need members of the Sanhedrin Agdola. So herein lies a third difference between these two mitzvahs. Whereas Kiddush HaChodesh is done and implemented by the Bezna Gadol, Tkufos, which means setting up an Iber Shana, will gather together a group, some of which may be members of the Sanhedrin Agdola, but that group doesn't exhaust itself, and it doesn't apply to the authority of the Sanhedrin Agdola. Ultimately, the Sanhedrin Agdola will give its gishpenkel, its final approval. But the actual shikul, what we call the dinu dvarim, when they weigh back and forth the pros and cons, is this year a year for Iber Shana or not? That's a whole different story. And that would again support the Bahag. And the Rambam Shitas know this is one mitzvah to make sure that the calendar moves smoothly.
Do they have to have a higher level of smicha, or does someone have to have a higher level than Yad Yadin? Or, what is there any difference?
That's a sugya in Masechta Sanhedrin. Do me a favor, Arthur, if you don't mind, just write me a WhatsApp, because that requires a lot more research into the details of Iber Hashana, the Masechta Rosh Hashanah. And Iber Hashana is a very complex sugya. Bruce, go ahead.
Do you know why the counting questions are only among the Rishonim? They don't appear to be asked in the Gemara.
Well, if you recall, the Ramban quotes time after time again different Gemaras to indicate from the Gemara what we're counting and what we're not counting. And very often the Gemara will say, well, this is only a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, it's not a mitzvah d'Oraisa, don't even think of counting it in Taryag. For example, if you speak about edus, right, testimony, so you have a whole slew of laws that apply on a d'Oraisa level, and that sets up edus d'Oraisa, and then you have a different kind of set of rules that are only midrabanan, that are only rabbinic. So, for example, in certain cases, we cannot rely on the testimony of a child. In other cases, we do rely on the testimony of the child. And the Gemara, time after time, is going to make these differentiations. With regard to Trumas and Maisros, the Torah is going to say that if you have Yerakos, which are vegetables, then you're not chayav in Trumas and Maisros. And yet the Gemara is going to point out that the Rabbanan will obligate us in Trumas and Maisros in the case of Yerakos, and so forth and so on, Kitnios and other examples. This is a tremendous sensitivity on the part of Chachamim, a part of Chachmei Yisrael in the Talmud, to decide what it belongs to the Taryag mitzvos. And from the Rambam's perspective, that means by definition that you're dealing with a mitzvah d'oraisa. And what, on the other hand, belongs to a d'Rabbanan. So the Gemara, for example, is going to ask about a bracha. When we recite a bracha, we've got to have a mitzvah that is included in the Taryag. If it's not included in the counting of the Taryag, the Gemara is going to insist that you can't make a bracha on it. So, for example, the Gemara in Sukkah says that chibut arava on Hoshana Rabbah, we don't make a bracha on that, because it's not mandated by the Torah. Sometimes the Gemara will say, well, it's mandated by the Torah, but only within a certain boundary. Let it be in the Azara, let it be in the Heichal, let it be in the Beis HaMikdash and the Harabayis, and so forth and so on. And then there are other cases where you're chayav in that mitzvah outside the boundaries. And then the Gemara is going to wonder, when you do that mitzvah outside the boundaries, is it Doraisa and it's counted in Taryag, or is it D'Rabbanan? And it's purely rabbinic. So, for example, if you take the Leil HaSeder, tremendous issues. Is matzah a mitzvah d'oraisa? And we have one sheet in the Gemara that says matzah is only d'Rabbanan. You can't count it in Taryag. The only mitzvah of matzah applies when you have a korban pesach. Al matzah sumorim yochluhu, and the matzah will accompany the Korban Pesach. Or alternatively, if let's say he's Tameh or B'derech Rechok, which we just read about 2 days ago, and that's called Pesach Sheni, then he'll eat the matzah on the first Pesach, and he'll eat the Korban Pesach on the second Pesach, meaning a full month later. But today that we don't have a Korban Pesach, there's no matzah doraisa. Morar, on the other hand, the Gemara says for sure is only d'Rabbanan in our time, because the Torah only tells us to eat Morar with the Pesach as an accompaniment. So constantly, the Gemara over and over again, and the examples are infinite, will be sensitive to whether or not we classify this under Taryag, or it's something else, or it's a mitzvah that was established through the authority of the Bezdin. And then we have another category called a minhag. And the Gemara very often will speak about a minhag. So, for example, Yontif Sheni Shel Golios, the second day of Yontif in Chutz La'aretz, is only a minhag. The Gemara says we know exactly when is Yontif today. We have no need for Speika Diyoma to doubt when is Yontif. And this institution is only Mishum Minhag, and that's called Minhag Avosenu B'Yodin. And there's so many nuances of differences in halacha between a doraisa, between a darbanan, between a minhag, and all this will come up in the Rishonim, but even in the Gemara before the Rishonim. In terms of counting the mitzvahs, yeah, Arthur, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, isn't this one of the problems of having it of getting because we can't use, we have a calendar, getting Adam to come in for the new moon to a Bezdin, wouldn't we have a problem with which date? Or would we simply say we had, in other words, fulfilled the deraisa, have the Adam come in and give their testimony, and then say, but we have Adam, but we will follow the continuation of Hillel's calendar, etc.
So wait a second. Are we talking Bisman
Hayom.
Hazeh?
Yeah.
Well, the problem with accepting Eidim Bisman Hazeh is a serious problem, because Kiddush HaChodesh is the express, what's the word I'm looking for, jurisdiction of the Bezdin HaGadol.
Right.
So as long as we don't have a Bezdin HaGadol,
but if you reform the Bezdin HaGadol, like there was, as we know, there was an attempt to get a Sanhedrin put back together, and they have Adam participate, isn't that sort of like, you can't change the calendar because the calendar was made by a previous Bezdin? Right.
So for that, you'd probably need a very high-powered Bezdin. I think they gave smicha to 5 chachamim back in Tzfat. Yeah. I don't know how many, but if, let's say, you wanted to form a Bezdin HaGadol, you would need 120 musmachim. If you had 120 musmachim, and it would form the status of a Bezdin HaGadol, that's a big controversy whether we could do such a thing today. But if you could, according to that view, then you're right. Then we would say that the calendar would be put on the side, and let's go through the mitzvah doraisa as it was formulated by the Torah of Kiddush HaChodesh and Ibra Hashanah.
Well, couldn't we just simply have the Adam come in, and because the calendar was made so long ago by people of a higher dar, wouldn't we continue using the calendar?
No, I think that, if I'm not mistaken, the calendar, which was Hillel Hasheni, was established because we don't have the ability to be Makadosh.
It took 13 years of fighting amongst the Jews before they finally accepted it.
But now that we have a Sanhedrin, then Hillel would step aside and say, do it the right way, and let's get Adam to testify. So let's just finish this up. He says, "Aval masha choshat harav lebal lochas ki choshuv tkufo shehu moneh shehu leida chochmas hatchuna v'lachshov bashi mitzvah devreim shesamchu l'tkosu mimasha omru minay lemitzvah la'odom lachshov tkufos amazol shenever shmaitum v'asisa ki chochmaskim minaskim lenei ha'amim ezi chochmu bina shileinei ha'amim v'omer zu chishuv tkufos mazolos chalilo lebal halochos Kizu ena mitzvah midivreim el yodim ba hu mitzvah al derech hazirus. the Ramban is claiming that the Rambam put a false libel against the Bahag. And he accuses the Bahag of something which, according to the Ramban, is nonsense. As if the Bahag was of the opinion that the study of astronomy, and you'd have to add probably mathematics, could be considered as one of the Taryag mitzvahs. And this is fascinating. Could you imagine that if you take, I don't think a simple course in astronomy will do it for you, but let's say you take advanced astronomy, you go for your PhD in astronomy, then all your studies are a mitzvah, according to the Rambam's accusation of the Bahag. Again, the Ramban denies it, but I'm more interested in how the Rambam understood the Bahag than I am in the Ramban's rejection of the Rambam. Let's understand how the Rambam understood the Bahag. He disagreed with the Bahag, but for technical reasons he disagreed with the Bahag. Those technical reasons are the reasons that the Ramban says the Bahag would certainly not count it as a mitzvah, but in theory, in principle, there's a possibility of taking a branch of science and placing it under one of the Taryag mitzvahs. Meaning, why does the Bahag, according to the Rambam's understanding of the Bahag, count kufos, meaning Ibra Shana, as a separate mitzvah? Well, the truth is that for Kiddush HaChodesh, I need expertise in how to investigate the witnesses. Also, I have to know exactly what the witnesses saw, so I need a certain expertise in astronomy, but very limited. Now we get to Tkufos. Tkufos requires an amazing amount of understanding of science. The Rambam, for example, has pages and pages of diagrams in his work, the Yad HaChazaka, to try to plot out how we do Ibra Shana. And it has to do with horizons, and it has to do with circulate, with the moon and the sun. It's amazingly complicated. And over the course of time, the non-Jewish scientists applauded the Jewish scientists. And that's what the Pasuk says, Ki hi chachmaschem ubinaschem le'mi al-amin. So Pasuk in Vaschanan, if I remember correctly. And it's amazing how much knowledge they had back in the day, before there was a PhD program in astronomy, before there was NASA, and they knew so much. And Chazal seemed to indicate at a surface level that acquiring that knowledge is a mitzvah. Minayin shem mitzvah Gemara and Shabbos. Minayin shem mitzvah ala adam. You hear this mitzvah ala adam? Again, an indication, Bruce, of counting it in the Taryag. Minayin shem mitzvah ala adam lachshov tkufos mazolos. To learn about the equinox and the all the mazolos, the different spheres. And the Gemara in Shabbos quotes a pasuk. Vishamartem v'asisem. Whenever you see the word vishamartem, you count it as a mitzvah. Ki hi chachmaskem v'binaschem li'nei ha'amim. So what is chachma li'nei ha'amim? Havi omer zu tkufas mazolos. And therefore, according to the Rambam's understanding of Bahag, there's a mitzvah based on this Gemara in Shabbos to calculate kufas mazolos. And guess what? It says mitzvah al adam. It doesn't say mitzvah al bezdin. We're not even talking about a mitzvah that's mandated for the bezdin agadol. We're talking about a mitzvah that seems to be mandated for every single person to be able to study kufas mazolos. It would take years to be an expert in that field. And the Ramban says this is an accusation that has no basis whatsoever. And he writes, he says, where is it? Chalila, very dramatic word here. Chalila lebal halachos. This could not possibly be a mitzvah. However, liyodim ba, those who are experts, then they have to be mizdares, and they have to take part lend a shoulder to this great mitzvah of Ushmar es Chodesh Ha'aviv, etc., Shmartem es HaChuka Azos. But the actual study of the science that's necessary for Chishuv Tkufas of Atzolos, Chalila, to accuse the Bahag as adding that as a mitzvah in Taryag. I'm fascinated by this because, very often we say to ourselves, Berzon, you've been hacking me for weeks and months about, what's Taryag and what's not Taryag. Like, what difference does it make? Who cares? Just come up with a list and enumerate 613. I don't care if you include this, you include that. I mean, here's an amazing nafkamina. If you're going to count this as a mitzvah, we all should be studying astronomy. And it'd probably take years and years of study. It's not like you get these little books, they have these handbooks, we used to use them to study for, I don't know if any of you remember the SATs. They had those, what were they called? There were two major companies that used to... Kaplan, yeah, but they had these little pamphlets and they would make a lot of money. There are no shortcuts to understand Kufas and Mazolos. Yeah, Bruce?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that in antiquity, every society had a calendar that was extremely sophisticated, and all the peoples, wherever they were living in these civilizations, this is not unique to us in particular. And if one would actually get a master's or PhD in astronomy, it actually includes physics, mathematics. It involves a lot of study.
A lot of science.
And it may be alluding that maybe we're supposed to be doing that. But I wonder, it also says to be on the Sanhedrin, you had to know all the languages. Now, all over the world, people study astronomy in antiquity, but only among us, we had a separate rule of learning to understand all the languages. I don't know anyone alive today who could do that. I mean, or it would take years of study. You have to wonder what they're really talking about. Are they really
I want to tell you this, Bruce. My sister spent years trying to master Korean until she finally gave up. It's impossible.
We have a friend as a PhD in Korean. She studied Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. Her PhD is in Korean. It took quite a few years, but that's three. They had to learn
70 languages.
So I'm not sure.
Again, I just point out there's no mitzvah to learn the 70 languages. Is there a mitzvah to learn Tkufas and Mazolos?
No, but on the Sanhedrin.
And this is a fascinating Havamina, that there would be a mitzvah to learn Tkufas and Mazolos.
Well, but to be on the Sanhedrin, I think they did. They had to learn. It meant that thousands were learning all the languages, so that a few knew it well enough to then be on the court.
Right. That's a pretty amazing achievement. The Gemara says about the Malach Gavril that came down to teach Yosef Hatzadik the languages, because otherwise they make fun of Yosef. How can you appoint him as the viceroy? But then Paro, it turns out, didn't know Hebrew, and he was very embarrassed. He actually was mashbia shvua doraisa onto Yosef. He shouldn't reveal that secret, that he couldn't master the Hebrew language. Hine patarnu. We now get to the summary of the Ramban. Patarnu balalochas miyoso toa b'shkios gedolos. We have now, after all this pages upon pages of ink that was spilled on these pages, we have protected the Bahag from any false accusations of shkios gedolos that the Rambam says. V'im kol zeh. Okay, after all this work, let's ask the bottom line question. If the Ramban was sitting here in the room, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman, do you accept the Shita of the Bahag against the Rambam? Im kol zeh, yoser divrei harav krovim lanu v'nirim be'einenu. I have to admit that although I've tried valiantly to defend the Bahag against the accusations of the Rambam, but the view of the Rambam, his opinion, is much more appealing to me. Shelo yimnu b'minyan hazeh. We should not count in the Taryag el mitzvot shehem shel Torah bilvad, only mitzvahs d'oraisa that are minat Torah. Im yeh cheshbon olav yodenu. He like adds a prayer. I only hope and pray that after we count all the doraisas, we'll end up with 613. Otherwise, we're going to have to borrow another bunch from the drabanas. Aval hi etzleinu chochma nelama mikama sfeikos asher be'inyan v'kama machlokas b'mi. He says, even if I agree with the Rambam that mitzvos derabanan should not be counted in the Taryag, but nevertheless, I'm still going to have to face many, many other issues as to exactly which mitzvahs should be counted and which should not. And he gives us one example, Kfar oraticha lavim aboy michal ese. What do you do when the Torah forms a lotase in the language of an essay? So we derive an isur, a prohibition, from an essay. Do we count that or do we not? She'ein bal halachas mona osam klal. The bal halachas will omit completely. See, now we have to tighten the belt here for the Bahag. The Bahag has to now kind of reduce the number of mitzvahs because he expanded them so much. And one of the reductions is going to be a mitzvah that's a lotas formulated as an essay. Ein bal halachas mono osam klal v'chein nira dvarim, and I agree with the Bahag on that point. Ki lama nimna miniya sheyesh ba lav mefurash. If the Torah prohibits it under a lav explicitly, and then we could derive it from an essay, we're not going to add the essay to the lav because the essay is only reiterating the lav. The lav above mechlal essay b'shtayim, we're not going to count it as two. V'nechshov zu atzava mechlal lavim v'zu b'chlal essay, and then we're going to have one prohibition that's counted under the lotas says. You know, there's 300. The 365, right? Sorry. And then we're going to count it again under the 248 essays. What if the Torah repeats the same lav over and over again? Are we going to count every lav as a separate lav in Taryag? Im nelchach ha'maisa shanachnu osim eino lanu el azhara achas. If we're going to follow our logical pattern, we're only going to count this as one lav. Shenimnenu midavar ploni. The Torah prevents us or enjoins us from so and so, even though it repeats itself over and over again. You know, I'm just thinking out loud. Let's take the Aseret Dibros. We have the Aseret Dibros twice. We have it in Parshas Yisro and Parshas Vayischanan. Is every one of the Aseret Dibros going to be counted twice? Says Ramban for sure not. The Torah is just repeating the same Yisro twice. What is it? Every time the pasuk repeats it, we're going to count it again.
Well, don't we apply that principle with the laws of kashrut? You know, it took a very enigmatic phrase not to cook the baby and the kid in its mother's milk, and because it says it 3 times, we come up with 3 different halachas.
3 different prohibitions.
Yeah.
Shabbos, the same.
So wait a minute. So let me get back to Bruce's case. So is that going to be counted 3 times in Taryag or only once in Taryag?
I think the separate mitzvah is about
absolutely. It should be counted separately. And I'll tell you why. Because it's written 3 times, and each time it has a separate prohibition. So in Manavshach, you should, no matter how you slice the cake, it should be counted as 3 separate lavim. And that's going to be a tremendous controversy as to whether or not we should count 3 separate lavim when each one involves a separate maisa, a separate action. So it's a separate independent prohibition, but it's written in the same exact language of the Torah.
Yeah, why do you call it separate actions? It's the same action, isn't it?
No, 3 different actions. Number 1, you're not allowed to cook meat and milk.
Yeah, but that's the drush on it.
What do you say?
That's the drush we derive from the same words of the Torah. Don't
correct.
Cook
so the Torah is giving me 3 different actions. Number 1 is telling me I'm enjoined from bishul. Number 2 from achil. Number 3 anoah. So 3 different actions, and it repeats itself 3 times. But the problem is, it's all Torah Sheba'al Peh. So what happens if we derive a prohibition from what's called Hamidos HaTorah Nidreshes? So if you turn the page for one moment, again, I'm fast forwarding for a second, to the Rambam on the very next page, the Rambam says, Ein roy limnos kol mashalamedim me'achas mishloshes midos HaTorah Nidreshes b'hem o beribui. In a word, Taryag mitzvahs have to be derived from the Bible itself, what we call Torah Shebechsah. If we're going to derive prohibitions from Torah Shebal Peh, either through the, let's say, Kal V'chomer or any of the other 13 Midos HaTorah Nidreshes, or from a Ribui, like, for example, Los Vashel Gedi is a Ribui, then we're not going to count it in Taryag. And we're going to see a tremendous machlokas about this. Do we count in Taryag that which is derived from Torah Shebal Peh? Has the same status, though, Raisa, but it's not explicit in the Torah. Fascinating machlokas with tremendous repercussions. But getting back just to finish up, I wanted to wrap up the Ramban. He says the following.
You can have a Doraisa that's not part of the 6.
Oh, yeah. Avi, you were talking about Zohar.
No, some of the Zohar I see is
Yeah.
different. That some of Zohar are two different because it's written differently. So I can see why it's two different mitzvahs. I understand that. But is it, you're saying it's possible to have a Doraisa not part of Taryag?
Absolutely. Let's say, for example, Orlas Chutzlarts is not counted in Taryag, and it's Doraisa, but it's Halacha L'Moshe B'Sinai. Or, for example, let's say the Surim of Basar B'Cholav, if they're derived from a Ribui, the Rambam says it's not counted in Taryag. It's certainly Doraisa. You get Malchus for it. The Im Yadanu Ki Minyan Arav Hu HaMakubal Nisbol Kol Zeh V'Nomar Ki Shinui Azhara LaKadosh Baruch Hu Milav Li Esei Klomer Milav Gomer Lulav Abo Michal Esei Ya'aso So Shnayim Mitzvahs B'Minyan Zu Azhara Amura Im Alavin V'Zu Me'esei Aval Yesh B'Direi Arav Od Sfeikos Hamukos Kasha Yisbar V'Ezros Habori Yisbar Shmo B'Yis'al. He says, even though I am absolutely convinced that if the essay Haba Michal, if the lav Haba Michal essay is a repetition of the lav, it should not be counted as two different mitzvahs in Taryag. Nevertheless, he says, there is reason to say that minyan arav shehu hamakubal, that minyan, the way the Rambam counts the Taryag, which I accept, can tolerate, that maybe this is a Shini Azara. That maybe the fact that the Torah formulates it, number one, as a lav, and number two, as an essay, which is called the lav b'chal essay, Yasa osom shtayim mitzvahs b'minyan ha-Taryag. That could justify minyan Taryag, meaning the breakdown of Taryag into two categories, essay and lotas, that itself could generate multiplied mitzvahs in the number of Taryag. The very fact that you differentiate, meaning until now we assumed that if the Torah repeats the same Avera over and over again, it's only counted as one. But what happens if the Torah repeats that Avera but once as a lotas and another time as an essay? Then there's a real strong push to count them twice in Taryag. Once as an essay, once a losas. Could you imagine? It's the identical prohibition, and we're going to count it twice. Why? Because because the very distinction and the breakdown between positive and negative commandments is going to justify multiple countings in Taryag. And that is a basic summary here of the Ramban, which is called Shoresh Rishon. And the machlokas between the Rambam and the Bahag regarding whether we count mitzvahs d'Rabbanan in the Taryag. And now we move on to Shoresh Sheni, and here again we're going to have a tremendous controversy, as the British call it, as to whether or not we count mitzvos that are derived from Torah Sheba'al Peh. And the Rambam says that we do not count mitzvahs in the Taryag if they are derived from a ribui or from shloshes midos she haTorah nidreshes by him. And it's very interesting. The Ramban, in his critique of the Rambam, opens up with Gazar Bo'ara. You see those words? Gazar Bo'ara. This is not a translation from the Arabic. The Ramban wrote it in the original Hebrew. Gazar Bo'ara. The word Gazar, which literally translates as a decree, has the implication that it doesn't necessarily make sense. It doesn't sit well with me. She'ein kol mashi yilamdu oso b'yachas mi'as mishloshe mitzvah Torah nidresses ben over ribui royal libnoso b'chlal mitzvahs. Why these weren't given to Moshe Rabbeinu Har Sinai? Moshe Rabbeinu didn't receive all of the interpretations of the law. What, he just got Torah Shebechsav and that's all he got? And you don't want to call it a mitzvah d'oraisa? V'loyomer gamkein shelo yimne dover mikol ma shesamchu oso li'achas mishloshe midas halolu. Just because we derive it from the shloshe midas haTorah just and therefore it's less of a d'oraisa than something that's explicit in the Torah. You know, you get the impression that he says here that the Ramban is really stuck on the following understanding. There's Doraisa and there's Darabanan. Doraisas have to be counted in Taryag, Darabanan's not. Because at the end of the day, despite all his defense mechanism for the Bahag, he agrees with the Rama. Okay, so if the whole distinction is Doraisa and Darabanan, there's no distinction between Torah, Yud Gimel Midrash HaTorah Nidreshes Bahem, and that which is Mefurish in the Torah. You're not going to tell me that a mitzvah which is derived from Shlosh Midos is less Doraisa than a mitzvah that's Mefurish in the Torah. I mean, that borders on a different sect of Judaism. Yeah, everything has to be explicit in the Torah. We only got one Torah, not two. Chas v'sholom. We don't believe that. So the Ramban says like this: you want to take mitzvahs to Rabbanon and you want to exclude them from Taryag, nicha. That I can understand. They weren't given to Moshe Rabbeinu in Har Sinai. Megillah was created by the Chachamim at the time of Esther and Mordechai, and Chanukah at the time of the Yevon, blah, 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 blah. It's not halacha Moshe Messina. But don't tell me that Torah Sheba'al Peh and Drashos Yud Gimel Midas HaTorah Nidreshes Bahem were not given to Moshe Rabbeinu Har Sinai. They're Doraisa. They don't fall short of anything that's explicit in the Torah. And you want to exclude that from Taryag. So this is going to be a major discussion here. Now, if I understand correctly, next week we're not going to meet. Is that correct? Did I get that right? You know, you need a Tekufas Mazolos here to be in charge of the calendar here.
Right.
Okay, so 2 weeks from now is what? That's already in June, I think. We're not in June yet, are we?
Yeah, we are in June. Sure,
Oh, we're already in June. My gosh.
Yeah.
Well, what day in June are we?
We are June the 5th.
The 5th. Oh, my goodness. I got to say happy birthday to a few people. Thanks for telling me it's June. So we're still in May. All right. So that means that what, 2 weeks from today would be like the 19th of June?
Yeah, we'll be back by then. Because both Arthur and I are going to be away, so.
Yeah, I don't know where I'll be. I'm not sure. Okay. So let me wish you a great day. And in case I don't see you before Shabbos, a good Shabbos.
Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, if I probably won't see you before Rosh Chodesh Sivan. I mean, Tammuz, I meant to say. So therefore, I'll wish you a happy Rosh Chodesh.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.